So hello and welcome to this live edition of the Asymmetrical Haircuts podcast. I'm Janet Anderson.
And I'm Stephanie van den Berg.
And together we produce a podcast for you on international justice. That's accountability, courts, truth commissions, prosecution, lots more, things that happen in conflict like war crimes.
And we like to have female commentators just to balance up a bit because we hear a lot of male voices and we like to balance that out a bit.
In introduction, we should also give a shout out to the Hague Humanity Hub, where we are both proud members, and the City of The Hague, where I'm a proud citizen and Stephanie tends to work quite a lot. They're supporting this podcast with you over Zoom as part of their week of the Peace and Justice Network in The Hague. That's all the NGOs and international organizations who work in this area. And my goodness, we have people on this call from all over the world. So welcome to The Hague.
And joining us today on the Zoom podcast are two great women. We have Kathryne Bomberger. Kathryne, are you there?
Here. Hi.
Kathryne is the Director General of the ICMP, the International Commission on Missing Persons. She's helped transform it from an ad hoc mechanism to a treaty-based organization, and one of the big feathers in their caps, is that they've helped identify more than 70% of the estimated 40,000 people who went missing following the wars in the former Yugoslavia.
And we also have Agnes Callamard. Hi, Agnes.
Hello.
Hi. And you'll see in the chat that we're adding people's bios there and the basic background information. And just to fill that in, Agnes has several hats. She's director of Columbia University's Global Freedom of Expression project, but she's also the special rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary or arbitrary executions, and she was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. And they're both with us today to talk about mass graves and how we investigate them. We're going to put links to all the background material about this in the podcast show notes, and we'll try and add some in the chat now, just in case you need to get up to speed on these things, and links to the kind of work that Agnes and the ICMP and their academic partners have been doing in this area.
A small point before we start, we want to hear from you, and this is Zoom, so please keep your mics on mute for now because we can't mute you. We will be asking a few questions ourselves, and then we'll open the floor and you can unmute when we call on you. Then we'll ask some more questions and open the floor again. If you want to join in, please write a question in the chat. And if you can, please raise your hand if you'd like to ask that question live, or you can put it in the chat and tell us that you want to pose it live, and then we can unmute you and call on you. Our colleague Dimi is running the chat. You could also message her directly if you want.
And honestly, I'm not watching the chats because there's too much else going on. So really, make sure that you raise your hand, make sure that you tell Debbie that you want to ask it. She's going to communicate the questions through to us. And we really want to hear your questions as well, because normally it's just Stephanie and me asking the questions, but this time you get to ask them as well. But before we start the substance, just one thing that I wanted to say is that this is a really delicate and a really tough subject. It's about the ultimate human indignity. In all societies, we have rituals, we have ways of saying goodbye to the remains of our dead, and a mass grave is a really awful thing. And we're conscious that there may be people listening or taking part in the Zoom for whom this is a very real thing. They might be a partner, family, a near victim themselves. They could be an investigator. We don't want not to acknowledge that, but we're going to talk today really about technicalities, responsibilities, mechanisms, and we might sound a little bit cold. Sorry. We don't mean to disrespect, and we do acknowledge that this is just a tough subject.
That said, let's get going. Why are we talking about mass graves at all? Surely, maybe it's a thing of the past. We all remember Rwanda and Bosnia, but do we still have a lot of mass graves now, Agnes?
Sorry. Yes, absolutely. We have thousands of mass graves around the world, and if you look back at our history, at the history of our humanity, then we're counting millions of mass graves. I like to cite there the expert Adam Rosenblatt, who wrote that mass graves are so widespread and so numerous that stretching across the entire planet's surface, they form an underground map of atrocity. The oldest mass grave is dating back to 10,000 years ago, while 20th century mass graves have left millions of bodies in their wake. It is feared that, and you know, the numbers are very approximative, that we probably can have about more than 30,000 people that are in mass graves. The mass graves from the Holocaust have not all been uncovered, and they are scattered across Europe. Just yesterday, I was in communication with Mexican civil society who were telling me about mass graves in relation to the cartels and drug wars that they are trying to uncover. As I was writing my report on mass graves for the United Nations, Rwanda uncovered a new mass grave, and they were estimating that there could be as much as 20,000 bodies in that particular mass grave. So,
not to cut you off, but
they're around us.
And what is the what are we talking about when we're talking about a mass grave, Kathryne? What is the technical definition of a mass grave? Are we talking more than 2 bodies? Are we talking upwards of 5?
Yeah, well, they really are. Thank you, Agnes, and that's a great explanation. They really are clandestine graves. I mean, there are graves that that contain the mortal remains of individuals that were abducted, that were executed, and buried in clandestine graves. So I think it's not really the number, although they're, as Agnes said, they can be quite big. But it's the fact that these bodies were hidden, and along with the bodies of evidence were hidden. So one can really look at them as crime scenes. And when you're looking at conflict-related mass grave sites or cases of enforced disappearance or other human rights abuses, you are looking at war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other atrocities. So they really are crime scenes.
What I'm wondering now is who's actually responsible at the moment for investigating these things. I mean, I'm kind of assuming if they're a crime scene, then we must be talking about police, states in some way. But I also think about people, you know, finding them themselves. So who's actually responsible?
Shall I start? Yeah. Well,
yeah,
states,
Kathryne.
in fact, are responsible. Governments are responsible for locating missing persons cases, for conducting proper investigations into mass grave sites. The problem is often states themselves or parties acting on behalf of the state were responsible for creating these mass graves or disappearing people. So trying to ensure the state takes responsibility means, number one, ensuring that they exhibit the political will to do so. And then secondly, building the mechanisms of good governance to allow them to do so in line with the rule of law. But therein lies the challenge.
And Agnes, when we go back to you, we have this new protocol. So what is wrong with the way, or what could be improved on the way that mass graves are investigated now as a general rule?
You know, I approach mass grave in a slightly different fashion, personally. Absolutely, they are crime scenes, but they are much more than crime scenes, or much, you know, it's not that crime scenes are not top things, but they are places where people know that their loved ones are buried. They are places with enormous meaning and signification above and beyond the criminal positivist meaning that we wish to attribute to mass grave. The reason why I started investigating the question of mass grave is when I was in Iraq, I encountered a range of people, including high-level officials, who told me that they were going to mass graves and they were picking up bones because they needed something in relation to their loved ones who had been killed. They knew that they are suspected that they are being killed at this location. Of course, they didn't know that the bones they had picked were those of their loved ones. And when I called on a very high level officials to protect the mass grave, to ensure that they, that they were exactly like you said, that they were protected because they were crime scene, he actually responded in a very interesting way. And he said, look, we want to investigate the crimes more than anyone else, particularly the crimes committed by the terrorist group called ISIS. But we also need to recognize that people need a place and need to hold on to their cultural rights, to their religious rights, that they need to have a relationship with a place that a crime scene investigation is unlikely to deliver. So what I highlighted in my own report is that while there is no doubt that investigation remain the most important objective, it is an objective that must be put into a bigger context and balanced out with other needs, other demands, and other forms of investigations which may not require for a mass grave to be disturbed or excavated.
So, Kathryne, can I ask you then, ICMP has a huge amount of experience in the practical business there. How do you balance those different demands?
Well, I think the first thing is, not to negate what Agnes has said, but what often happens is there is a double standard, unfortunately. And we can see that today in Europe and in the West in general, where a proper investigation into, let's say, a missing person's case will be conducted if you're white, if you're European. However, the Mediterranean today has turned into a mass grave. Europe now has the largest number of dead and missing migrants in the world, and a different standard is used to address those issues, one that really is led by humanitarian organizations. But I think the key here is that states do have a responsibility to excavate these sites. They are on sovereign territory, but they also have a responsibility to secure the rights of living, surviving families of the missing. And this is critical for them because most of those who are missing tend to be men, meaning the majority of those whose rights you're trying to secure are women. So trying to ensure that their rights are secured, including justice, including the truth about what happened, including an honest reckoning of the crimes that were committed, are critical to societies moving on. In fact, mass graves are wounds in the earth's crust. There's no question about that. But being able to find them, to properly excavate them, to restore the rights of surviving families of the missing is not universally accepted. And I think that's what we're trying to do, to ensure that there are standards and that all families of the missing, regardless of where they are, regardless of their national origin, their religion, sex, etc., have the same rights. And that's the challenge in today's world.
And when you investigate these mass graves, you have, or the ICMP has a very long history of experience in this. I've seen the pictures from Bosnia where I know everybody is kind of dug up. Are you working on new, less invasive, possibly quicker techniques? And can you share some of the technology in that sense that you're working on?
Absolutely, yeah. In the context of the former Yugoslavia, we assisted the governments in excavating over 3,000 mass grave sites. So this is huge. And this, of course, exceeded the domestic capability of any one of these states to conduct excavations at that level, or that many, and at a level where evidence could be provided to international courts, which it eventually was, which is critical. So the number of forensic pathologists, prosecutors, investigative judges that are necessary to excavate sites, that many sites and at that level is huge. You also need forensic archaeologists, anthropologists, that can provide support, because the types of mass graves that we found, and we can have a long list of different ways that people have horrifically and deviously tried to suppress information about missing persons cases, is just nauseating. So yeah, using new technologies is important to help them locate mass grave sites. Witness information is critical. LiDAR, aerial imagery is very important, but the most important is witness information and political will on the part of the state to find everyone equally, regardless of the circumstances of their disappearance. Then you link that to DNA-based identification technologies, where you can link the identity of that person back to the crime scene. So that becomes important in part of telling the story, not only of the crimes committed, but helping families who desperately want to understand what happened to their loved ones through a process of truth-telling, reveal that process.
I'd like to turn now to some of the different writing that we've had, these two different reports, these different publications we've had. Agnes, you have written for the Human Rights Council and for states to say they need to think about this more. There's also been what's called the Bournemouth Protocol, and we should shout out to the academics involved in that, Dr. Melanie Klinkner and Dr. Ellie Smith. And I know, Agnes, you also provided a forward to that. I want to ask you, Agnes, is this kind of a movement that's going on now? Why is it that we're thinking about this at this point?
Oh, no. Look, the situation in Iraq, thousands of mass graves, with the current level of resources and expertise, including from outside Iraq, it will take 800 years to handle the current mass graves. 800 years. Mass grave in the Holocaust, from the Holocaust, like I said, there are at least 1,000 that have not been handled. Mass grave in Rwanda, they have not, most of them have not been excavated. Mass grave of Cambodia have not been excavated, but victims have been identified. They have been identified through other ways than through the excavation process, which is extremely resource intensive and expert intensive. So there is a huge gap. In fact, one of the largest gaps I've ever encountered as a human rights person between what we are seeking, what the principles are, and what the reality on the ground is. I mean, a huge gap. That what compelled me to do this report, because with the current level of technology, even, and I'm hoping it is gonna develop further, it is just not gonna happen that the vast majority of mass graves are gonna be handled, excavated, investigated in the way that they should. So what do we do with that situation while we plan for that to happen? How do we as an international community handle that situation? How do we plan for the treatment of mass grave in Yemen, for the treatment of mass grave in Syria? There are nothing in the international peace agreement at the moment that refers to mass graves. What is being referred to are different legal and policy framework. The one on investigation is the most important one. The one on the missing is another one. And what I have said in my report is that, in my view, while they are important, they are just part and parcel of what mass graves are. And that we as an international community need not only to invest far more resources at a political policy level, far more goodwill and determination on the part of the state, we also need to think conceptually about the mass grave in ways that, and that take into account the multiple dimension of the mass grave, which is, you know, it's a crime scene, it's a site of missing people, it's a site of crimes, very massive human rights violations. It's a place as well for cultural right, for religious right. It's a place where the last rights, RITS, must be acknowledged. It's a place for memory, and memorialization, in my view, is an absolute central part of truth telling and of accountability. So what I try to do in this report is to encourage us all to think about developing a conceptual policy legal framework that takes into account all of the dimensions of the mass grave, and that then develop policy recommendations so that we can match the needs with the resources and the commitment. And let me just add one more point. I did a lot of research to find out how much mass grave played a key role in the search in criminal justice. And in fact, what I found out is that with a few exceptions, it is not the case that evidence from mass grave is essential for criminal investigation to be pursued. Croatia is the case that we should all seek to emulate, but Croatia is the exception. Largely, it is the exception. Rwanda, Cambodia, you know, there have been processes towards truth-telling, towards reckoning with the massive violations, the genocide that took place. This was not based on excavation. Maybe it would have been done better with excavation, I don't know. But I think we need to acknowledge the fact that there is a huge gap between what we should try to do and the reality.
And well, as somebody who sat through a lot of war crimes cases for the former Yugoslavia, you say Croatia is the absolute example. And I also think Bosnia is, and I remember sitting through trials at the ICTY and seeing the pictures from the mass graves, especially Srebrenica, where they show the wire that was used to keep they show the blindfolds, all these things come very technically from mass graves. So I know for the ICTY, it has a huge impact. And then if we look at the kind of more practical application of uncovering mass graves, and we look at the Bournemouth Protocol, Kathryne, can you explain a bit for us how important it is for the ICMP to have this protocol and to try and have a unified way of approaching how you excavate mass graves?
Absolutely. And I first want to give thanks to Melanie Klinker, who's here, who took the lead with Bournemouth University in putting together this report. And it's fantastic that it's done, and it's going to be translated into multiple languages. And I see Carolyn Horn and other people that participated in creating this particular guidebook. It's absolutely essential because as governments exhibit the political will, they often don't know how to deal with this issue. So, you know, exhibiting the political will to ensure that these mass graves are excavated is the first step. Building the institutions. I mean, we've worked in Iraq for 10 years. We have a program in Syria. We have a program in Colombia, trying to build the mechanisms of good governance to bring institutions together that are required because it involves the ministries of health, justice, medical legal institutes, foreign affairs. So this book, this protocol rather, provides a map for states now that are interested in beginning a process of searching for missing persons to understand what the mechanisms are to properly excavate a mass grave site. And that's key. And, you know, any government reading this or any family of the missing looking at this, because I think multiple audiences will benefit from this protocol, will understand what the process looks like. And the more families of the missing are educated, or those that have lost individuals are educated about what the process can look like, they can advocate for their rights and they can advocate for what they want. And states can also understand how to link the various components of that excavation to the institutions that would be responsible for this process. So I really want to commend Melanie and her colleagues in Bournemouth University for putting this together. And, you know, I hope that it will be widely read.
I just want to take a moment to shout out to everybody again. Please do feel free to put your questions into the chat. We do want to hear what questions you would like to ask as well. I mean, we have a list, you know, mile long, because we always do for every podcast. And we've got plenty to ask people, but maybe you've got, and they don't have to be questions, they could be comments, they could be experiences. Please feel free to share yourselves. Stephanie.
We are talking this about how it's hard for states to kind of do things. And we've talked about that people try to start excavating themselves, their own loved ones, because states are not doing enough. How could you get states to do more? Where is the big problem in? Is it the inexperience, as Kathryne said? Is it the unwillingness to uncover sites that might not be, I don't know, politically useful for them? Agnes, when you look at why states are kind of dragging behind excavating mass graves and trying to identify the people in them, what are the causes that you see?
Well, all of them that you just mentioned: lack of goodwill, politicization of post-war and post-conflict situation, unwillingness to turn to the past, censorship of the past event. I mean, it's a mixture of things. Sometimes society itself is not pushing for excavation. I mean, the situation, a very interesting case of mass grave is a mass grave from Spain, for instance, from the Franco era, and how long it has taken for, in fact, family members themselves and civil society to take on the role of the state, not only against the state eventually, but also against the trend within their own society. So, you know, originally there was, of course, it was impossible to excavate the Franco mass grave, but then there be a form of self-censorship settled in on the society. And it's only, you know, over the last 10 years that children and grandchildren of the victims have said, no, we want everything to be known. We want to know where they are. We want to excavate them. And they are doing the excavation. So it is really a mixture of things. I've said in Cambodia and in Rwanda, the lack of excavation did not necessarily mean lack of reckoning, because there was process of judicial process of truth telling and of holding to account those that were responsible. So there are also places where governments, for a variety of reasons, sometimes with the people, sometimes against the people, are going to look for alternative ways of finding the truth that do not require excavating thousands of mass graves. So, you know, there are many reasons. Lack of goodwill, I will say, and determination to hide the truth, not caring, is certainly a primary factor.
I wanted to turn to one of the current issues. I'm thinking about the deaths in the Mediterranean, Kathryne. You have these large numbers of migrants coming across from various places in North Africa, particularly, and we hear regularly of boats foundering, of people ending up on the bottom of the ocean. Is that a mass grave?
Sound, Janet.
There we go. Don't know what I did. I think I remember that the ICMP is getting involved in that area. How are you treating that? Is that a mass grave for you?
Let me find two ways of responding to this. Thank you, Janet. I just getting back to what Stephanie said earlier about states and the political will. The world really changed during the 1990s when it comes to addressing this issue. There was really a historical shift in ensuring that states take responsibility and that perpetrators are held to account. And you can see this through the creation of ICTY, its counterpart for Rwanda, the creation of the ICC in 1998, and even the creation of ICMP in 1996, where our mandate is to ensure the cooperation of governments and others in locating missing persons cases. And I think conflicts that happened earlier, especially in Latin America, and Agnes referred to Spain, things that are Lebanon, conflicts that took place earlier, were not subject to the same type of international community approach. So what we're seeing today in terms of what happened in the Western Balkans, what's happening in Iraq today with the creation of UNITAD, for example, what's happening with Syria and the creation of the Triple IM or the Double IM for Myanmar are very new ways of dealing with a very old issue to the extent that they're dealing with mass graves. So applying new technologies, but also applying a rule of law approach is very new, ensuring that states take that responsibility. So there is a gap. I mean, Cambodia, for example, yes, hasn't found many people. It's not been part of the process. So really, we're defining something that's very new. And of course, it's ironic now turning to Europe. Spain was also providing support to countries like Bosnia-Herzegovina. And often the question would come to Spain, but why aren't you doing anything about your own cases? And you're providing support to Bosnia-Herzegovina, or European states providing support to the Western Balkans, where now they have an increasing big missing persons problem in their own backyard. And of course, I think this has to do with understanding again, dealing with your own cases and the political dynamics and the truth-telling dynamics that are involved in that, and the difficulty of addressing these issues. And then when the state doesn't, it's left to families of the missing and other to, with their bare hands, like, for example, in Mexico, to conducting this work. I have not, I mean, others have also called the Mediterranean situation a mass grave. And here there is, an equivalent metaphor. And somebody from Human Rights Watch, I think, did a very good article recently about I Can't Breathe, about a Somalian, ship, a ship that had been wrecked and went down in the Mediterranean with primarily Somalian migrants on it who are drowning, who can't breathe. So increasingly, this is becoming a problem. But I think it's just a metaphor to recognize the large number of missing persons now and the fact that proper investigations into their disappearances are not happening and that there is a double standard. So even though there's been a historical shift since the 1990s, it is not widely accepted throughout the world, but it is important that states take that responsibility. It doesn't negate, in fact, it enhances truth-telling. It enhances securing those rights for families and allowing them to memorialize missing persons cases. And I would like one day for the controversy regarding Srebrenica to end, for example, that we have scientific proof about what happened there. We helped Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, find almost 90% of the 8,000 Muslim men and boys that were killed in 1995 as part of a genocide. But now memorializing that, removing, having an honest reckoning with what happened is important, not just for the victims, but for all of us as humanity to recognize the atrocities that countries can commit in the name of nationalism.
And we had, Janet and I received a question about balancing the rights of different people in mass grave exhumation. And we had a mirrored question from Christian van Eyck, who was talking about mass graves as a potential crime scene, but also issues treated as privacy and family life issues. And he asks, do mass graves require new ways of conceiving of human rights and the dead? And more specifically, could either of the speakers speak on the right to commemoration or reburial under more fundamental rights like the freedom from cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment?
Yeah, that's exactly my point of the point of departure of my report, which is the mass grave are the embodiment of so many different issues. We need to we need to challenge ourselves to develop a richer understanding of the human rights that are contained in the mass grave, and the rights in relation to religion, in relation to culture, in relation to death are extremely important. And I'm highlighting those rights not because I think they are more important than the right to truth, but because they are part of the right to truth, and that communities who want truth, they also want their dead to be treated in a certain way. They also have, they should at least have a say in determining the fate of a mass grave, determining how they want a reburial to take place, how an excavation to take place. So I completely agree with the spirit of the question, and I believe that within the existing, at least European jurisprudence, we have a very good legal reasoning and policy reasoning of balancing of rights, which I will wish to see more applied proactively to the mass grave. And if I may just add something in relation to the migrants, because I actually wrote 2 reports as a special rapporteur on the migrants and the killings and disappearance of the migrants, including in the Mediterranean. I personally have treated and continue to treat the Mediterranean as a mass grave. I continue to see the bodies lying at the bottom of the water as bodies in need of humanity, in need of us giving them humanity because they have an intrinsic humanity, and that can only be done through searching and at least giving them a decent burial while the process of identification take place. But to me, the migrants issue and the mass grave at the bottom of the Mediterranean is first and foremost a call to us for protection. Because this is happening in front of our very eyes. You can probably argue that some of those mass killings around the world are not something that the world could take immediate action to prevent. We can discuss that. But the death, the unlawful death of the migrants at sea, there is absolutely no legal, no policy, no practical reason as to why we are not preventing those deaths. And yet, this is exactly what we are doing. So that's why for me, it's really important to highlight how we have completely lost our humanity when confronted with migration.
Yeah.
Kathryne, did you want to add something?
Or I absolutely agree. And not only allowing the deaths, but also not engaging in proper investigations. There are now, we've heard up to 10,000 children missing in Europe. So these persons are missing as a consequence of, migration, but child trafficking, child slavery. But just to go back to Stephanie's point, regarding family life and so on. I mean, just to give you an anecdotal account of what happened in the case of Srebrenica, and dealing also with the needs of family to find out the truth. We were excavating so many sites. We were helping the states, involved doing this. But what became clear, after the first excavations, it's that the perpetrators had gone back to the original mass grave sites, following these executions. And after the war ended, they removed the bodies from primary sites to multiple secondary sites. So the bodies could never be found again. And the horror of this became very clear as we continued with these excavations. And this is where DNA, we started using DNA because of this, because there was no other way to identify these bodies. Now, the families always wanted their sons and husbands back the way they last saw them. And what they were getting, in fact, were pieces of bodies as the excavations took place and as DNA was able to identify body parts. So they wanted to know also spiritually, at what point do we bury this person? And in line with Islamic traditions. So we went, to the local imam, we had conversations with them, at what point could they bury them? And a fatwa was issued initially advising them to wait till at least 70% of the body was found. And this became challenging, of course, because you never knew when you would find additional parts of the body. So this is a form of mental torture for families of the missing, to hide them this extensively. For somebody to know where they are, to deliberately withhold this information is understood to be a form of mental torture. And of course, the families of the missing from different cultures, from different religions, different traditions, need guidance in this process from where they are. So yeah, as the state conducts its investigation, because that is, to ensure that perpetrators are held to account, there is no doubt, absolutely, that the families of the missing and how one treats the process is critical. Also, once you find them, how do you notify the families? This can also be a brutal process I've seen, where information, for example, is put on a website before information is directly provided to the families. So, when I talk about states, states, these states do hold these mass graves. They hold them. They're there. So I see Carla Quintana is here. Recently Mexico, for example, implemented legislation on missing persons and created a commission on missing persons. And these commissions, even though they exist, have a very difficult time in coordinating a process on a domestic level to find them on the one hand, and then dealing with hundreds of thousands of families who are at breaking point, who have been waiting a long, long time to find a missing relative. But they also do want justice. And I think this is the mistake we make. Families of the missing want many, many things because we are all different as individuals, but they want justice. Of course, they want the truth. They want multiple things. But what has happened, I think, in the years that I've been doing this, which is 25 years, and I think largely because the majority of missing are men and the majority of those left behind are women, we've often thought that they don't want justice. So this has been an enormous mistake that has to be rectified. And the way we address these mass grave sites is probably why I'm insisting that these investigations are done properly in line with the rule of law. But just to go back to Agnes's point, no, not all, to collect evidence for criminal trial purposes, you don't have to go through every single mass grave. But the state itself must demonstrate a goodwill effort to try to find everyone. And there, at what point, what defines success? In the case of Iraq, absolutely, you're not going to find everyone. People are missing from the regime of Saddam Hussein, the war with Iran, the first Gulf War, Daesh crimes. Mexico is also huge. There are migrants and then Mexicans missing. It's extremely challenging. But the families of the missing need to see a good faith effort on the part of the state that explains the process to them, where they are treated with respect and where they see that their rights are being protected.
We've got a flood of questions coming in. It always happens as you're sort of 3/4 of the way through an event. So a quick one, if possible, Kathryne, from Eva Vukasic, just referring back to the Mediterranean issue. What are the practical challenges of trying to find and identify bodies? She knows a lot about the Srebrenica technicalities, but what are the challenges with the Mediterranean?
Yeah, well, one challenge is now Italy has retrieved as many bodies as there are missing from Srebrenica. So that's number one. So we're already dealing with an enormous challenge in the context of Europe. And Europe has not had a missing persons problem on this scale since the Balkans War, since World War II. So this is an enormous challenge. The first thing is each one of the states, because they haven't had this challenge ever, they have to build, again, the capacities to be able to address this issue. What tends to happen is you have multiple ministries, the maritime ministries, justice ministries. So ensuring that within states, there's a task force or equivalent that can search for missing persons. Then, because families have been separated, in some cases, Syrian families, for example, the mother, the father, the children are, separate locations on a Greek island or somewhere else. So ensuring cooperation between multiple states in the Mediterranean is absolutely critical, and that's not happening. So we have put together a joint process of states that now works together to share information, because they're not sharing information. So if Greece has in its custody a child who needs to find its parents who may be in Spain or France, there is no mechanism currently to share information. So I think, ensuring that these mechanisms are put into place and this issue is not outsourced to the Vatican or humanitarian organizations that cannot possibly take on a challenge like this, and shouldn't, because it's a rule of law issue. And here, if they do that, then they're engaged in a double standard that doesn't allow for proper investigations and undermines our democracies in the longer term. So the starting point is taking this seriously and ensuring that the resources and cooperation between states exist.
Agnes, anything to add on that, on how they should be investigating in the Mediterranean?
Well, look, the situation is extraordinarily complex when it comes to, first of all, finding the bodies at the bottom of the sea. So the technicality of it is very difficult. Many of the bodies are in a state where identification is going to be a very difficult process. The forensic experts that do the work rely on whatever is left of clothes, for instance, and indeed on DNA. But the DNA is meaningless unless you have a bank, a DNA bank you can compare the DNA of the missing migrant with. Many of those migrants, it's difficult to identify which country of West Africa or North Africa they are coming from, or indeed Syria. There is no database of DNA from the countries or possible countries of origin against which the DNA of the body that has been found can be compared and can be matched. In my report, I said, the only way we can tackle that is through a real global process of scientific DNA banking system that can be shared. That in turn raises huge policing, private data, personal data questions. For instance, within the United States, the various agencies involved in the identification of migrants don't even have the same scientific technical system that allows for their DNA to be compared. FBI has one, other agencies have one, and they don't work with one another. They speak different technical language for a variety of reasons I'm not going to get into. All of that to say it's not impossible. The international community, when it comes together, can tackle very large problems, but there is no will at international level to look for the creation of principles and data banks that would allow the collection of DNA on a systematic basis in Nigeria, in Senegal, and so on. The holding of those data in a way that is safe and secure, that is not there yet. And I'm not even going to get into the next step, which is, even without identification, where do we create a sense that this is our common task, that this should be something to which humanity together is prepared to remember, is prepared to hold a tribute to those migrants. That is not happening at all, except at local level, driven by local people. There is no sense globally that we are confronting a crime against humanity on a global scale, because that's how I've decided to call it in my own report. You know, so I'm not saying that we should not do anything. The absolute contrary. I just want people to understand the complexity of the issue that we are confronting. So where do we go from there? Well, first of all, we acknowledge the effort by many Italian local communities, you know, because when I did my mission there, I was very impressed, not by the state, you know, not by what happened at governmental, at the executive level, what happened at the level of the people that welcomed or that had to carry the bodies, what happened at the level of the cities, what happened at the level of the little ladies that goes to the cemetery and put flowers on the tomb of the missing, of the migrants. That's where I found the energy to be human and the search for our humanity while other processes are ongoing. And I think we need to encourage that, we need to value that, we need to celebrate when that happens.
Thank you, Agnes. We are going to go to another question next from somebody identified as MK. And he or she has a question regarding prosecutions relating to mass graves. And they say, if we look at the ICTY, the evidence coming from mass graves was crucial for proving a number of crimes, but we haven't seen prosecutions of the act itself of hiding the bodies. I'm going to kind of jump in here and be my geeky self with the ICTY. In the Jokic case, and a case that followed one of the Srebrenica cases, the campaign of hiding the bodies was very, very central, and it was mentioned, and they were convicted for that, specifically for that whole reburial for secondary to tertiary to quaternary mass graves. And personally, that is one of the reasons also that Kathryne was explaining, that they find so little bodies and the kind of torture that is. And I've sat with mothers of Srebrenica who've told me, you know, on their coffee table that only the 3 finger bones of one of her sons was returned, and she couldn't bury him because she was waiting for more bones to come. But that's the personal experience of the kind of impact it has that you have so many mass graves and people are hiding this. The question is very specifically, are there more prosecutions maybe in other countries or in other contexts of people accused of hiding bodies and making identification more difficult? I think I will hand it over to Kathryne in first instance.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stephanie. And this ties in, that question ties into what Agnes said earlier about having centralized data repositories. And in fact, using DNA, using evidence coming from a mass grave site. It's an integrated scientific effort that includes data collected from the mass grave, including from forensic archaeologists, anthropologists, the DNA, where you're able to link the crime scene back to the identity. In the case of Srebrenica, and under revealing the secondary crime, all of those methods were absolutely key to demonstrate that there was a secondary crime of a cover-up. So just to underscore that. And in the context of the Mediterranean, this is exactly what we're trying to do. Or in Syria, for example, there has to be a centralized database that not only holds DNA, it has to hold all evidence related to the investigation into a mass grave or a crime scene or missing persons cases. Same thing with the USA Today. And thank God Biden has issued an executive order just the other day to create an interagency task force now to deal with the issue of separated children that have been separated from their families. I mean, this will require collecting data, again, from multiple countries of origin. Same thing with Europe, collecting data from multiple countries of origin. If you calculate that people are coming from 85 different countries to find their missing relatives and to deal with these crimes. So yeah, we have provided evidence in at least 30 different tribunals, many of them linked to the former Yugoslavia. I mean, on the horizon right now, it's kind of bleak, I have to say. And I think this has to do with the fact that, what happened in the 1990s is kind of in a downward spiral, unfortunately, at the moment, and the international community that existed at that time and the willingness to create these courts and to strengthen the work of the ICC is not there at the moment. So we're seeing more hybrid situations growing, including, UNITAD investigations and the IIIM. And of course, there are these universal justice mechanisms that are absolutely crucial for Syria at the moment. But this really needs to step up. So I think while that at the moment is on shaky ground, all the more reason right now to ensure that these mass graves are properly excavated to a level where evidence can be provided. Because if you don't do that, if you don't leave the door open for accountability in the context of Syria, Colombia, Mexico, and you engage in a process that doesn't do that, you will never have that evidence if there is a moment when these cases can go to court. So, proper documentation using advanced scientific means, which, by the way, are less expensive. This is not the Cadillac version of anything. I mean, we maintain a standing capacity to help countries with this process. There are ways to diminish the cost to states. So I think that this requires a lot of thinking, but where I really agree with Agnes is this is a global challenge. Every single country in the world is faced with this challenge, and we must recognize as the international community that this is a very key issue to ensuring peace and stability. So excavating mass grave sites is a direct link. Uncovering these crimes is a direct link to dealing with the past, untangling the political manipulation by using these mass graves of sites of hatred, the current situation or current countries that are using this issue for political ends, and inciting violence on the back of these mass graves. So ensuring that persons are accounted for, that these cases are properly dealt with, is an investment in peace and stability. And I think that is the key message.
You both keep on coming out with stuff that I think, yes, we could end the podcast here and we just, that would just round it all off. But then I keep on getting questions in from people. So I'm going to keep going, if that's okay with you. There's one here from Selin Orek, which is about practicalities of being an investigator. He or she, I think it's a he, I'm not sure, recently got a job as an investigator, and witnesses keep dying. That's one thing that's happening, and people don't want to give information when it's about someone from another affiliation, another community, and they don't want to give information. And that wondering whether either of you have some experience, some tips about how to obtain investigation leads, how to find out about things like mass graves. And yes, I know you have a lot of practical experience of human rights work in your past. Maybe you could start.
No, I didn't quite understand the question, I'm afraid.
About effective ways of getting investigation leads in order to find mass graves, the difficulty sometimes of witnesses not wanting to give you information because it's about the other side, the other community.
Look for other witnesses. I mean, it's very unlikely that a mass grave doesn't have, either through scientific tools, and Kathryne was talking about a large number of mass graves are found using satellite and other imagery, and witnesses are likely at some point or another to report, even a mass grave of one or two person. If a witness doesn't want to talk to you, you've got to look for another witness. I mean, I'm not sure about, I'm not sure I understood the question.
Kathryne, do you have any tips of new and different ways of obtaining investigative leads?
That is extremely difficult when a witness has information in a state where they fear reprisals and they feel that there is no trust there between, the state and those survivors who are willing to provide information. It's absolutely critical. So that environment must exist for that to happen. I mean, for example, today in Syria, it's absolutely not there. Giving information like this, you do so at your own peril. Some organizations, including ours, we have what we call an online inquiry center, where those who have information regarding the existence of a mass grave site can anonymously upload the grid coordinates or location of that site onto our website. But eventually, to find that missing person, it is or to excavate a mass grave site, you are again going back to dealing with the sovereign state that has custody over that site. So there are ways for witnesses to confidentially provide information, but again, to do so in a complicated and political environment like this, where there is no trust, completely understand the peril or risk they think they're putting themselves in.
And,
Stephanie, are you there?
yeah, I made it back. A question we got in from Kathryne Bomberger, who is studying archaeology, looking at Neolithic human remains, but she wants to know what you can do as a forensic anthropologist to help bridge the gap between the principles of excavation and the realities on the ground, and how can the way we examine bodies help to do the best possible jobs in bringing both the truth to light and accommodate the emotional, religious, and cultural needs of those loved ones of those in the grave. And I wanted to note here that when I read the Bournemouth Protocol, I felt there was a particularly heartbreaking little sentence which basically said to forensic anthropologists, don't promise to the families to bring to identify their loved ones at any cost, because it's something you can't promise, and you will kind of work yourself to the bone trying to do that. That's a very bad way to say it. But to basically tell forensic anthropologists and people excavating mass graves, don't promise that you can identify everybody, because you can't. Yeah. And then I realized how much stress forensic anthropologists excavating mass graves must be under with the family. So Kathryne, this is something that you've worked more closely.
I have many colleagues that are forensic anthropologists and archaeologists, and many friends that are also forensic archaeologists, and my really heart goes out to them. It is a tough job that has to take into account many considerations. Working in very difficult environments, often with difficult governments that may not want to engage in the issue properly, having the patience to really help them through a process, because it's a long process of conducting these excavations, meeting with the families of the missing, which can be really hard in trying to explain the process, but it's critical that these forensic anthropologists and archaeologists educate the families about how the process works. So we're often pulling them away from the site and having them come into classrooms or meetings with families who are, again, torn apart to try to explain this. But it's critical that they share their knowledge, not only with states that are engaged in the process, but with families of the missing. Because if the families cannot understand the process, then it's going to be, and cannot play an active role, therefore, it's going to be harder for them. So this is really a way to bring them in. So it is a complicated process, from forensic archaeologists, helping to excavate the sites, to the anthropologists then carefully exhuming the bodies and documenting this, and trying to be very careful not to do this in such a way that the bodies are not broken up, because in the end, what you want to do is return these mortal remains as respectfully as you can to the families of the missing. So once they are taken out of the mass grave site, properly store them in a mortuary where they can be processed, where samples can be taken for DNA testing. And again, a small window, putting no markings on the bones, making sure at every step of the way that not only are you documenting evidence, but this is somebody's son, this is somebody's mother, brother, and the body will have to be returned to them. So it's an enormous challenge and an enormous task, an enormous amount of pressure that they're under, to document and carefully return the bodies, always thinking about the families of the missing.
I know we're going over time a little bit. I hope that everyone here can stay on for another couple of minutes. We're going to make this the last question from the audience. It's from Mariano Machain. He said, Agnes talked earlier about how in Mexico there are many thousands of unidentified bodies. Is it similar, would you say, Agnes, in other countries? And they ask, what can be done? I'm wondering myself with that, is this so overwhelming that it's impossible, or can we actually change things? What do you think, Agnes?
Sorry, I'm sorry, Janet. Again, I'm not sure I fully understand.
The question. I apologize. It must be the way I'm putting the question. He says, you talked about in Mexico that there were many thousands of unidentified bodies in mass graves. Are there similar situations in other countries? And the question is, what can be done? And my question on top of that is this just so overwhelming? If your answer to that is yes, there are thousands all over. And is it so overwhelming that we cannot actually change this? Or do you believe that we can change this situation and that we can get identification and we can deal with this overwhelming number of bodies?
Look, I think my position is that you can keep hammering the principle until you're blue in the face. The current context will not deliver their realization. We are looking at our humanity is built on mass grave. Our history is built on mass grave. They are the recent one, they are the older one, but the older one are as meaningful to people as the recent one. As an international community, I have explained that in my view, we do not have the proper framework to handle the mass graves as they are defining who we are. As an international community, we have relied on the framework provided by the missing and on the framework provided by investigation to tackle mass graves. I think what I'm trying to suggest is that mass graves are that and much more. And the scale of the issue, the number of mass graves around the world, the multiple meanings that mass graves hold, in my view, require that as an international community, both of policymakers, politicians, community leaders, and experts, that we are prepared to go outside our confidence zone and tackle the reality that we are confronting, which is, again, our humanity is built on mass grave, and we do not have a framework for mass grave. Point number one. Point number two, what it means is that we need to develop a framework which allows us to tackle both mass grave where they exist and to tackle to develop a policy for mass grave which involves the responsibility of the international community. We have examples of that here and there, but we do not have a global policy to tackle mass grave. We have a global organization to tackle the missing. We do not have a global organizations or a global policy framework to unpack and to deal with mass grave in their historical and multiple characteristics. And point number three, because of the multitude of mass grave, even in one single country, what I have suggested as a first step is that we determine whether we should create a new institution that would have the trust of various stakeholders and that will act as a legal guardian of the mass grave, while we determine how this mass grave is going to be handled in history, you know, in the short term or in the long term. Many mass graves may be excavated in 15 years. What are we going to do during those 15 years to ensure that they are protected? So as a first step, in order not to be overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, the first thing is to identify at least where they are. to be able to map them out. The second is to develop at national level with international expertise a policy on 5, 10, 20 years for the treatment of those mass graves. And then bit by bit, we can start implementing that. That would be my recommendation for handling the scale of mass grave in a given country, such as Syria, such as Iraq, and so on. And my recommendation will be as well to integrate this policy framework, which may be a 10-year policy framework, in peace agreement, so that they are resourced, so that there are commitment attached to them, and so that we do not feel overwhelmed as your as the question highlight. Ultimately, the mass graves are who we are. They are about our humanity in multiple ways, in more ways than one, and we need to find ways of preserving them, excavating them if this is required by whatever obligations or rights, and creating memory around them.
And on that note, with both the past and also the recommendations for the future, I'm going to kind of close this part of the podcast and go to our asymmetrical haircuts questions. But because we're running so late, we're not going to ask them all. We're just going to go to the good stuff, which is, what do you have on your nightstand right now that you're reading, or what are you binge watching, or what are you listening to for podcasts that you can recommend? And we'll start with Kathryne and then go to Agnes.
Okay. Well, on quite a number of books, if I ever get a chance to read them. Infinite Jest, I don't know if you know that. No? Okay. It's by near my bed here, David Foster Wallace. Also very, very good book, by the way, if anyone wants to read it. Also A History of the North Sea, because I'm here in The Hague, so I want to understand more about my environment. And before I go to sleep, just to calm down, always read The Guardian recipes, because that just takes the world to another place. I like eating, I like cooking. Not that I cook well, but that always calms me down. So good recipes at the end of the evening.
And yes.
Thank you.
Oh wow! I was just looking for the title, because I'm unfortunately hopeless with title. But I am reading at the moment several books on artificial intelligence and novels, science fiction novels on robots. And The Sea of Crust is the one I'm going to recommend. Because I think we are going to be extraordinarily challenged as an international community by the meaning of what it means to be human in a couple of decades, if not earlier. And I don't think we have really any response to, or any even idea of how to deal with a robot that will develop empathy and a moral judgment. So
Wow.
I haven't found an answer, but that's what I'm looking for.
Great. Well, thank you for a really diverse set of recommendations there. And I think we're also asking you in the chat if you in the audience have any recommendations, anything that you're reading at the moment. We love to hear what you're reading, and we will put those onto our show notes if we see a list of things there. So finally, just to say thank you to our team behind the scenes, Humanity Hub, also the team who are here in the room with me to organising all of this, to ICMP who helped get this together, Agnes and her colleagues for their help. Do tune in to the podcast. We'll get this one up later in the month, but we have them up regularly, and we make sure we have women talking about genocide, interviewing victims, all of the big issues that concern us here. I'm Janet Anderson. Thanks for joining.
I'm Stephanie van den Berg, and this has been Asymmetrical Haircuts.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. I think we're going to close it down now. We're going to stop recording our parts, and we're just going to leave this open for a moment to see in the chat what people have to say. But thank you all so much for turning up here, and see if we can try and find out what some of these ones in the chat, what says somebody's been reading fantastic podcasts and so on. Who's doing a fantastic podcast? It's not ours.
It is ours. They're complimenting us.
Oh, that's nice. No, podcast witness history.
Ah.
Okay. And Philippe Sands, the rat line. Yes.
Oh, that's great. Yes.
Yeah. Philippe. I'll add them to our list here. We're just keeping it open for a couple of moments. Do keep adding stuff if you have anything. Witness history. So I don't want to
Recipes
lose
also welcome, and I'm looking at you, Mom.
Recipes always. Let's see, rituals, women at work, how creative women get things done. Goodness, sounds like that's one I should know, because
we don't ever get anything
done. No, this is a real outlier, this. Creative women getting things done. Okay.
The Parable of Noah and the Parable of Talents by Octavia Butler, says Jill Wilkinson.
Jill, you always have lovely things that you're reading. You were reading the Pat Barker last time we did a live thing. So, In Extremis, Lindsay Graham. That sounds interesting.
This sounds like something that I want to watch. The Silence of Others, a documentary about the Franco mass graves.
And War Doctor David Knott. We're going to have a page just for all these recommendations that have come in from everybody, and they're keeping on coming. Borderlands, New Terror. Yeah.
I saw Quo Vadis Aida, which I just saw this week, which is highly recommended, Bosnian movie about the fall of Srebrenica, which was, even for somebody like me who knows the story in excruciating legal detail, was extremely moving and very beautiful and very well done. So I recommend that highly.
Yeah. Okay, how do you feel, Humanity Hub? Do you want to cut it off? Okay, got a thumbs up. Say goodbye to everybody. Thank you so much for turning up, and see you on the other side of the podcast. Bye.